A couple of things quickly before we get started. Housekeeping things. Pretty much 5 seconds ago, the pop quiz of today will have closed on Canvas, assuming that 5 seconds ago was 2 p.m. So, yes.
I had a question about that. I've legitimately been in class all day since it opened, and so I didn't. Is there any way I can take that?
Well, come talk to me after class. So that was one. Two, to make up for the pop quiz where I forgot to announce the questions before. So Thursday we'll have Professor Eric Mack from Tulane come here to give a guest lecture on Nozick and separateness of persons argument. Basically the stuff that we'll be talking about today. It's a talk about self-ownership, which Eric believes in, and he believes in it about as much as one can believe in it. So, which is another way of saying I don't know anyone who'd believe more in it, because I think once you hit the ceiling, then it's just hard to overtake him. So we'll see that, like in a moment, like this libertarian view of self-ownership. There's not that many people who will sort of, without any shame, stand up and defend it. There's a lot of libertarians who feel themselves sort of compelled to that view, or say like, well, some ifs, I really believe it, but, and then there's some waffling, and so like, you might get that from me. But Eric is none of the wafflers. Eric just says, yep. So, but he's also really, really smart, and he's really written influential and good stuff on this. Yeah, I read him because I find him interesting, not because I have to. That's the kind of, anyway. So he's also a very unpresupposing person. So if you have questions and things to talk about, he'll be interested to talk about it, and you can shoot at him, and he'll give you his best back. So I hope you'll be here. Al will be here. And so then on Thursday I'll post like a short essay question on the basis of the reading and the lecture, and then I'll give you some, like about a week or so to do that if you want. If you do that, then that grade for that short essay question will replace the grade for that messed up pop quiz. If you don't take it, then the old grade will stand. So if you don't want to replace it, you can also, and you still want to write the essay, that's fine by me too. Just write the essay, tell me I don't want to replace it. I'll tell you what I think about the essay. That's if this is, for example, a thing on which you want to write your large paper, the short essay might be a good trial run. Try out a couple of ideas, and then I'll give you some feedback on that, and then you can build that into a longer paper, for example. That generally, oh, so yeah.
Will you potentially post that short essay assignment on campus, like as an announcement?
Yeah, it'll be announced, and then it'll be an assignment with a text entry box, like all the way in the beginning. Remember we had that 500-word essay on the state of nature stuff? It'll be the same, but a different question, obviously.
Will it also be 500 words?
Yeah. What was I going to say? Oh yeah. Some of you have run some paper IDs by me. Not all of you. And those of you who have not, and those of you who have also, maybe second time, but I highly encourage that you do. Deadlines are here before you know it, and the longer you wait with picking a good start of your essay, you know what I'm saying. So, anyway, it is really true. You've heard these things before, and you hear them over and over again because they are true. And so I'm not requiring that you submit an early draft, but I'm highly encouraging you, and if you do, I'll give you feedback, and that feedback will, unless I'm completely bad at my job, it will help you write a better paper, right? And a better paper means a better grade, which means good stuff for you, right? What I'm telling you is that if you want to get good stuff, this is a route that you should take, and it runs through me. So, some people are so good that without any planning, they can just sit down and ace a paper on one day's work. Those people exist. There are not that many of those people, so statistically speaking, you're quite unlikely to be that person. Right? Keep that in mind. All right. That's about it. Any questions about housekeeping business? Yeah, Alan.
I have a rough draft right now. Do you want me to email it to you, or do you want me to give you a hard copy?
You can email it to me. Yeah.
Okay.
And I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Good. Look at this. This is the kind of stuff that gets you a Schwerk Award. All right. We'll get on to the we'll get on to our the final of our readings and discussions. And that's Nozick and Cohen on self-ownership. So you've read, hopefully, Nozick's pages, and you've read Cohen's critique of it. Cohen, this is the book that Cohen wrote, Self-Ownership, Freedom, and Equality. This is basically Cohen going for, 250 pages through every part of Nozick's theory and trying to show why it's really important and interesting, Cohen thinks, but when you really start pressing on the important points, the whole thing collapses, more or less. So Cohen is or was, he passed away a few years ago, unapologetic Marxist, just like Nozick is an unapologetic libertarian. And so they're on opposite ends of the spectrum. But they agree on a number of things. They agree on the general method in philosophy, that you need these type of analytic arguments that Nozick is trying to provide, and Cohen is trying to provide as well. That was a big deal at the time, by the way. Cohen was part of a group that included other people like John Elster, but also Hillel Steiner, who called themselves analytical Marxists. There was a group of philosophers and social scientists who were really trying hard to come up with a version of Marxist theory that you could understand, to put it bluntly. So basically they said, look, if you read Marxist is really, what's the word? Flamboyant, maybe, as a philosopher. So it flies all over the place, and he's overstating things. It's sort of a little like Rousseauian or Hegelian. So like it's not the easiest read, and then when you start really digging into the text, it looks like contradictions and overstatements are everywhere. And so. But of course, you'd be silly to say that there's nothing there, given how many people have found it so inspiring and important. So what the analytical Marxists was trying to do, said, okay, well, let's see what kind of theory we can extract from all that work and put it as clearly in like the sort of analytical way that someone like Nozick or Simmons or Rawls would put it, and make as much sense of this theory as we can. And so Cohen is one of these people, so he was very important in that regard. But that's also why he's taking Nozick seriously. Right? The other reason why he's taking Nozick seriously is because Nozick gives us an argument for self-ownership. Basically the idea that we own ourselves, and because you own yourself, nobody else can have a claim on you, on your energies, your time, your work. That's one. And then two, so that claim Nozick defends, and Cohen says that's a very attractive, morally speaking, attractive, plausible claim. That's something we should take seriously. He ends up rejecting it, right? He ends up saying, but once we really look down under the hood, it's a mistake, self-ownership. But he says he does see the attraction of it. The second part is the point where Nozick says, well, if you own yourself, then you also own the stuff that you produce using yourself. And like we saw last time, Cohen wants to accept that too, right? Because that's the whole basis for the Marxist theory of exploitation. If you give that up, then you cannot explain why the capitalist does wrong when they don't pay the worker the full value of their labor. Why would that be wrong? Well, it's only wrong if the labor belongs to the worker. And so if the worker is going to give the value to the capitalist, then the capitalist better compensate the labor in full. And so capitalism is said to be exploitative, say these Marxists, because structurally speaking, under capitalism, employers are not compensating their workers fully. And that's how the exploitation happens, that's how you get the accumulation of wealth at the top, and et cetera, et cetera. So that part Cohen wants to accept, right? So he wants to say, look, if you really own yourself and you work using yourself, then you have a right to the stuff that you produce. Now, if you put those two together, then you get Nozick's conclusion, right? That means, well, full self-ownership. Nobody can make you do anything for their benefit. And we'll go over the argument that Nozick gives here in detail. So he has to reject one of the two, right? He has to reject either this Marxist idea of exploitation, doesn't want to do this, or has to reject the idea that we own ourselves, like Nozick says. And that's what he's going to go say in the end. All right. That's the whole background context of this story. So here's the argument that Nozick gives for self-ownership. It's an interesting argument, by the way. It comes and goes really quickly. So quickly, actually, that students of Rawls for years, decades, kind of mocked the theory. Tom Nagel, who is one of the most famous philosophers alive today, he wrote a review essay when Anarchy, State and Utopia came out called Libertarianism Without Foundations. And that was sort of the party line for Rawlsians for decades to come, which was the idea, well, you have this whole libertarian theory, but ultimately there is no basis here. Like, he says, if people have these rights, libertarian rights, then Rawls is false. But why would people have these rights? Well, there's 3 pages maybe of this. And then, so Nagel says, well, it's clear bullshit, we can move on. Cohen, of course, says not so fast. Right? But anyway, here's the argument as much as there is. And it's an interesting argument, even if it is sketchy. And it moves from an idea about what rights are, or the function that they have, the role that they play, to an idea of the content of the rights. So he's trying to pull a theory of content, libertarian content even, out of an idea of what rights are. All right, so here's how it goes. Here we start with the function, right? The role. What is the role that these things play? What is their function? How are they operating? And so this is the phrase that Nozick uses, side constraints, right? Anyone want to give I know it was one of our reading questions last time, I think. What are side constraints? Like, why does he call rights side constraints?
They're like claim rights that people inherently have against you that you do certain things, so they kind of, those claims that people have against you restrict some of your actions because they inherently have these things.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so the claims, right? The claim if you know the Hofeldian scheme like you do, then they're claim rights that he's talking about. And they function like what he calls side constraints because he's distinguishing between, on the one hand, rights that people have, and on the other hand, moral goals, right? Things like outcomes you might want to achieve. So you might think, here's something that I value, more money, right? That's a goal that I have. I want more money. And how am I going to get there? Well, there's an easy way, that is just take yours, right? That gives me more money. But if you have a right over your money, then that right stands in the way. And it's sort of, it's a constraint on my desire or my goal to get more money. And so he doesn't really say why he calls them side constraints, but the way I tend to think about it is sort of spatially, which is a goal sort of in front of you, and you're trying to move towards the goal. And then there are constraints that sort of on the side that get in the way that you have to navigate in order to get to, I don't know if that works, but that's the point anyway, right? Another metaphor I've sometimes used is you think of rights as bubbles, that every person has a bubble around them, which is their right, and then other people cannot penetrate that bubble without doing you wrong, right? And so if you really want to get visual, so if you have here your goal, and here's you, right? The fastest way to go would be a straight line, but if there's these other people with these bubbles around, then the idea is to morally get to your goal, you have to do something like this, right? You have to like navigate between, so they pull you to a side. All right. A little bit of a deviation. A little bit more detail maybe on side constraints, but that's the idea, right? They are barriers on the way to goal-oriented actions, more or less. All right. So that's what rights are, just conceptually. That's what they do. They're these constraints on our goal-oriented actions, goal-directed behavior. And he says, well, if you're going to respect people as separate individuals with their own lives to lead, then we have to acknowledge the constraints on how we may use them, even for the best of ends. Right? This is interesting, by the way. We haven't read this part in Rawls, but he takes this idea of separate persons from Rawls. Rawls is has a famous objection against utilitarianism, and because he wants to present his own theory as an alternative to utilitarianism, which was at the time much more popular than it is now. And Rawls says what utilitarianism gets wrong is it doesn't treat people as separate individuals, each with their own life to lead. The idea being like it just throws all the lives on one big pile and then tries to maximize the pile. And so you allow all these trade-offs between people. And really, if you want to take people seriously as autonomous or independent human beings, separate creatures, you have to take seriously that the value isn't just the aggregate of all the people's happiness, but it really resides in each individual as a separate unit. And if you do that, you can't be a utilitarian, says Rawls. And so Nozick wants to kind of take this from Rawls and use it against him and say, no, if we take separateness really seriously, then we have to go all the way. You have to say, no, then we can't use them for any goal outcomes. There is a critique of Rawls that relies on this, where he says, in the original position, remember, we are all sort of reduced to one, right? Because the veil of ignorance strips away so much of our individual characteristics and features that there is no bargaining to be done in the original position, right? It's just a rational choice, which from each point of view, your point of view, my point of view, it's identical because of all the stuff that's stripped away. And sort of the Nozick or the Nozickian would say, that's really not treating people as separate individuals, right? That's treating them as the same. So there's going to be trade-offs allowed in the original position between the least well-off and the rich people, specifically on behalf of the least well-off and at the expense of the rich people, that Nozick says, actually, that too is a violation of the separateness of persons. So you might want to think equality is a really important goal, but if you want to achieve equality, Cohen, Rawls, whoever, you're going to have to navigate the rights of people over themselves, and if you navigate them over themselves, you have to navigate the rights over the stuff, right? Because it's really the same. And so now you can see how for Nozick this is going to be a big, big problem, right? These side constraints. Because it just basically takes equality as off the table as something you can just pursue through government policy or redistribution.
So do you think kind of how Cohen was talking about like self-ownership, or not the opposite, but his substitute for self-ownership would be serving, and self-serving, like the obligation to serve? Do you think Cohen would view kind of like navigating through the bubbles as self-serving? So maybe in order to like get to equality, you can't just go straight through the other bubbles without doing some sort of wrong. And so let's say that instead of doing that wrong, you have to have an obligatory form of self-serving or something like that to get to the goal. I don't know if that was clear in the sense.
Yeah, so well, Cohen definitely wants equality, right? So he thinks that's the most one of the most important things, anyway. And he does recognize that if Nozick is right about side constraints, so they involve you, your person, plus all your stuff, right? So we might, I had a pen somewhere. Right, we might think this is a person, and then this is the stuff that they mix their person with or something, right? If we're going to get to equality, if everyone cared about equality enough, right, everyone could voluntarily choose to just give their stuff to people so as to make equality happen, right? But of course, Nozick would be fine with that, right? He says, look, in a libertarian society, people get to choose whatever they want to do. If we have libertarian socialists, right, who just recognize they can't force anyone to make equality come about, but they all want equality, then equality will happen, because we'll get all these people will go to Will Chamberlain's basketball game, they put the quarter in there, and then at the end of the day, Will says, wait, I've got all this money, there's people with much less, here's some money, right? And so he'll convert D2, right? Like the D1 gets converted into D2, and then Wilt will just revert it back into D1, and that's fine, because Wilt has the right to do so. Of course, what if we're not living among those people, right? Or what if we live among only some of those people? And Cohen wants to say, well, in that case, we still should pursue equality. But then we have to say, well, then these bubbles can't be the way that Nozick is saying it, right? Because these bubbles get in the way of any type of non-voluntary pursuit of equality. These bubbles say, if Will chooses to give some of his money to the poor, or all of his money to the poor, then wilt go away. But go ahead. But wilt, if you don't want to give any money to the poor, like literally zero, then go ahead, wilt. All that falls within your choice. And so Cohen will have to get rid of these bubbles in some way. Right?
Yeah. And could that be through the obligation for self-serving or something like that? Let's say
Yeah, right. So if there is an obligation to serve others, and serving others just means serving them so that they are equal, right, for Cohen, then what that means is this bubble isn't as extensive as Cohen isn't as extensive as Nozick is claiming it is. Right? Nozick says this protects everything, fully your person and your stuff. And for Cohen, it can't be that way. And so for Cohen, actually, he thinks the obligation to serve others means that part of yourself, your person, actually lies outside of the bubble. And so there's part of your person, so maybe we should do it like this, right? So this is your person, and this is your rights, right? And so part of yourself is protected from other people using it, but the other part is not. And so this part that's not protected by the bubble, that's the stuff that you have an obligation over to give others. And because you have an obligation to it, there can be a claim put on you.
Because that seems like it would make equality a lot easier to reach to, because
Yeah, sure would, yeah. Actually, Nozick's view makes equality in all practical. I mean, we can conjure up this thought experiment of Wilt and everyone else being this fully fledged, motivated, ethical socialist. But in the real world, people aren't like that. And so in the real world, this Nozickian view makes, practically speaking, impossible to get equality. If you accept this, just give up on equality. Right? And so Cohen doesn't want to do that, right? Because he thinks equality is super important to him. And so he's trying to figure out how to have to readjust this picture, right? And the way he's doing it is by rejecting the self-ownership thesis, which is the idea that your whole self is fully protected from other people's demands. And if it's outside of the bubble of rights, then other people can have a claim on it. And so Nozick says, well, if equality and taking care of the poor is so important, then why don't we force people sometimes to work for the poor? And Cohen, at least in principle, will have to say, it's an open question. Maybe we should. So, there might be other reasons, right? Maybe there is other things that happen once you start forcing people that are so important that override the demand for equality. Maybe the kind of force or coercion you have to use is too intrusive or something. But that's a different story, right? It's not because your body is yours that we can't make you work for a poor person. Right? You just don't have that right over yourself to say no. All right, so here goes the argument, right? So we have to respect people as rights holders. This is just a point about the function of rights. A point about the function of rights combined with a claim about what it takes to respect people as inviolable or separate. Now these constraints, right, they reflect our separateness, and because of that, the rights prohibit using people against their will. That's just another claim about the function of this, right? So the side constraints put you in control of whatever is yours. Whatever it is you have a right to, people can't use it without your permission. That's the claim here. And Nozick actually claims that this idea combined with, when we apply to people, that captures Kant's idea about not treating people merely as means. And you'll have seen that Cohen goes after that too, right? Cohen spends a couple of pages saying, that's not true. We'll get back to that. All right. So then it follows that rights that we have prohibit using people against their will, including for the benefits of others. Right? Now, if you own something, so if some object cannot be used against your will, then you're the owner of it, something like that is to be added. And then people are self-owners in the libertarian sense. There is some sneaky stuff going on here. This argument, I'm probably friendlier to Nozick than most professors you'll run into, but there's sneaky stuff going on here. This argument doesn't work. In particular, this argument doesn't say anything about how extensive these rights must be. Right? There's a claim about that we must have rights, and what these rights do. But at no point is it said that these rights have to be maximally strong or protect everything, your full body, your full self. But yet the conclusion is trying to assert that, right? So what Nozick, if he was going to give us a full argument, would have to do is would have to say that any time we don't treat people as complete, absolute owners of themselves, maximal self-owners, maximal right protectors over their own body, that is a failure of this type of respect or inviolability or Kantian insight. Now maybe that's true, but he has to do a little more than that. And he can't derive that just from the function of rights, right? That has to be that's a substantive claim you have to just make good on. It's not that hard to see how Nozick might do that, right? You might just say, look, for any part of yourself, if you don't have control over it for others, then you're being seen as a resource for others. Right? But you need to defend that in some way.
So what about if it's not against the
Well, then we have a case like when Wilt is just choosing to redistribute his money himself. Yeah. Then if he accepts it, if he consents to it, then it's perfectly fine for Nozick. You know, in the exam and in the reading that I've posted for the Mac talk on Thursday, you'll see that one of the examples that Mac gives to support what he thinks really should be this libertarian self-ownership view. He gives an example from, from a couple of years ago in Cleveland, that person who had these women tied up in his basement and Max says that's really horrible, right? And actually what is really horrible about that is that these women aren't given their full self-ownership, right? So he says that's really where you see the appeal of this view in its clearest sight. This person is treating them as objects for his own desires. But that doesn't mean that sexual desires per se they're not that bad, right? Like you can have sex, that's okay. What you can't have is sex against the will of a person, right? You have to respect that they have a claim over, they have their say, and if they say no, then no really does mean no, right? And what that means is your person has to be inside of your rights, right? Like your right to say no protects your body, the whole of it, and it doesn't matter whether this person, whether there's inequality of sexual satisfaction in our society, and this person was still a virgin at 40 or something, right? Like, that doesn't give him any more claim on these women's bodies. Right? It doesn't matter if this person was really poorly off, or really needed it, or something, or has some really super strong desires. And no just means no, right? It doesn't matter that if these people, it doesn't matter if he only used part of their bodies, the intimate part, but the part. Right? And they just left their body, left the rest of their bodies on top. You just use this little. No, right? It's just the whole thing is covered, right? So that's the intuition. Now, if the women were consenting, then it's a different story. Right? If the women chose to sleep with him, then we have a normal case, right? So, yeah. So if they're willing, then it's fine. But the fact that we have to wait or we have to ask, right? We have to wait for him to say yes. Before we can use other people in whatever way you want, sexual, productive, redistributive, whatever, right? This use is use, say the libertarian. The fact that we have to ask them shows you that you really believe, right, that your person is protected by rights, that you in that sense are an owner of yourself. Okay. That's, by the way, the kind of argument I think that you need to add, right? Like these type of examples will help you motivate that the whole person is captured by the self-ownership thesis. All right. Here's two questions that we are going to ask. We'll really only talk about this first one for today. The other one, it's just a question to keep in the back of your mind. So this is the question here, right? Like, is Nozick right about this, that it's absolute prohibition on the use of others? Here's another one. Remember, though, that Nozick does have these in these pages, he discusses really difficult cases, right? Difficult cases about so-called innocent threats and so on, where babies are strapped to the front of tanks, and people falling down wells on top of you, and the only way you can not get, like, protect yourself and not die by getting crushed by their bodies, by vaporizing them with a ray gun or something like these things. And the idea being that some of these cases, self-defense type cases, might be cases where even though there is a self-owner falling towards you, right, and this person might be innocent, someone else might have thrown them down the well at you, right? They're not trying to kill you. This person is caught in the moment just like you are. You might still do things that would normally violate their rights in order to defend yourself. And he says, you know, what if you have these like human shields, right? Like he gives the example of strapping babies to the front of tanks, but we know things about like the Middle East, where at least allegedly, in the conflict with Israel, Palestinian fighters will sometimes store their weaponry in hospitals, for example. And the idea being, well, you can't now, in good conscience, bomb our weapons anymore because there's these innocent people in it. So that's sort of the analogy of a baby strapped to a tank, right? And Nozick says, I don't know. I don't know what to do about it. But the fact that he says, I don't know what to do about it, right, means that he says, well, it's not clear that self-ownership prohibits these things. Maybe sometimes there are cases in which our rights over our persons can be overridden and we can do things to people that would otherwise violate their rights. But so here's a question, right? But when it comes to justice and redistribution, suddenly none of these exceptions are there anymore, right? And so there's some more messing around going on here. There's a little sneaky, I think, by Nozick.
So is this what a lot of philosophers do when they are approaching a particular touchy part where they don't really want to contradict themselves, but they just say, I don't know?
No. Nozick is particularly, this is, I think, a particularly Nozickian thing to do. He has throughout, I mean, if you read the introduction, he says, like, you know, one of the things that I'm going to be doing in this book, occasionally, parentheses, throw out questions that I've thought about, but I haven't really come up with an answer yet. And so I take it to be that he's saying, I really don't know how to do it. And there's a whole industry of literature being produced since on exactly these questions. There's a lot of people in the ethics of war who talk about this. They ask exactly, because in many cases in war, if you're going to fight war at all, you're going to have to deal with cases like this, right? Collateral damage is kind of like this. And it's hard, so it's not, yeah. No, so I think what more often philosophers do is they just don't mention it. So Nozick is mentioning it as something he doesn't know, and that's I mean, yeah, whatever the better way is, but.
Any of these philosophers, like, kind of, I don't know how to read this, but it seems like no matter what it is, you can't be completely 100% on one side without there being some sort of exception, like to the self-ownership thing.
Right.
Also to the Cohen's idea of, pronounce it, or obligatory.
Right.
Giving, like, there's always going to be some sort of exception, and I feel like it's a lot more gray rather than just black and white. Like, it has the world is this, the world is that, or the world should be this, or the world should be that. So do the philosophers ever acknowledge that?
Well, if are you asking me whether philosophy might not confuse you, then no, if you do philosophy, you'll be perennially confused. These are really difficult questions.
Do philosophers kind of, I don't want to say assassin, but show humility in the sense of like,
What does this word mean? I don't know what this word means, humility.
I mean, it seems like Nozick has to have a little bit of Cohen, and Cohen has to have a little bit of Nozick for either of their ideas to work. And
So-
either of them acknowledge that.
Well, no, no. No, you can't. And I think that's good reason why the answer to that is no. So one part of what you're saying is definitely true, right? So the views that we're dealing with two opposing fairly extreme views, right, on the possible spectrum of positions. These are the outliers. Now, they don't occupy these extreme views just sort of to be controversial or because they're jerks or extremists or something, right? They get led towards these positions by trying to make their views or their theories consistent, logically consistent, right? And so that means if you're going to have these extreme views, you're going to have to, I guess the technical term the philosophers like to use, like bite the bullet. I don't know if that's a colloquial term, but sorry?
Accommodate.
Well, you have to swallow a couple of bad implications, right? So one of the things that someone like, we'll get back to this in a second, but like someone like the self-ownership theorist wants to, like say I want to be a self-ownership theorist. If I think about this, then I think, well, okay, I get a lot of goodies, right? Because I get to tell people that I have a very good answer for why putting women in the basement and strapping them down and raping them is wrong. Like I have a very fundamental theory that gives me, like this is the worst of the wrongs, right? Because it's the starting point of everything. So that's really nice, right? And I have an idea about how rights work, and it fits nicely, and I can quote Kant, and that makes me feel good, right? So there's a lot of goodies there. But then there is this point where, this example that we talked, the ubiquitous example of this, the kid is drowning in a pond, and I could just jump in, or reach in even, and pull them out and save a life. Can I be required to do that? And then I have to say no. Right? Just logically speaking, if I want to be consistent with that view that no, absolutely, people cannot use me for, even though the moral good might be pretty great, I have to say no. So I don't want to say no, right? That sounds really awful. And I would do yes, but now I have to do yes and say no, so that doesn't really sit right. So there's a cost there, right? And so maybe that's why you're thinking, well, maybe we need a little bit of Cohen in there. So we say, well, that's, in that case, yes. But the problem is if we're going to be logically consistent, right? If I say yes in that case, then in other cases that are relevantly similar, I'm going to have to say yes too, right? And that is actually much more demanding than lots of people think. You might think, well, okay, I can be required to reach in for this one kid, but guess what? There's about 1 billion people in the world who are in dire need of assistance, right? They live on about $1 a day. That's nearly the same as being drowning in a pond. Like these people are trying to fight day to day to stay alive. So, and I have more money than I need, more money than they do, right? So if I can be required to reach in, then I can also be required to send all my money that I don't need to these people by the same logic, it seems. Right? Now that's not so, so now, I mean, maybe you think that right, but now we're really far away from this libertarian view that I was thinking was really nice and comforting a moment ago. Right? So I cannot let in just a little bit of Cohen without letting in a lot of Cohen. Right? But of course, vice versa, Cohen might have to say, well, if people can be required to help others who are in need, then well, what about people who are in dire sexual need? Right? Why can't they use other people's bodies? Why can't they be required to let other people use their bodies? Or what we talked last time about this book by Cécile Fabre, a professor in Oxford now, who says, well, people can be forced to make their organs available to other people. Well, if you don't believe, like if that part of that kidney is outside of your bubble, right? Then actually, yeah, you can, right? And that doesn't sound so nice either, right? So if now you want to say, okay, well, we'll hold that one, so this Cohenite view or the Fabre view has to actually let in a little bit of Nozick, so that you can say, no, you cannot use my kidney, and you cannot use my genitals, right? Well, then you have to explain why things that are relevantly similar, like my arms, right, or my mind, why you can use those, right? And so this is why people end up with these views that seem to have these really glaring problems. They know they have these glaring problems. It's just when when you have to ask, well, organ harvesting, drowning children. Nozick goes one way, Cohen might go another, right? Although he wants to resist this. So that's how you end up with these type of. Now, of course, these are not the only two possible. Other people think that there is space in between, where you. But yeah, that's the. I don't know if that got to it, but it's not. The problem is you cannot say both yes to the drowning child and no to the organ harvesting without having some really good explanation of why these two cases are very different, right? And both Cohen and Nozick seem to think that you're not going to come up with much of a story, and if you can't come up with much of a story, well, then you have to really choose which one you're going to go with. And because if you have both, then you're just being inconsistent, and philosophically that means you're contradicting yourself. That's sort of the end of the game, right? And just the basic tools of logic that we're using. They rely on not allowing any contradictions. That's the foundation.
To have a theory
Yes. Contradict, if you can show, if I develop a theory and you can show that I've made a contradiction, by my membership card of the philosophical profession, I ought to trash that theory. That theory goes. That's about as bad as if you, like, as objections go, that's the best objection. That's really that's like a stick of dynamite in the philosopher's toolbox. Then you can't do that. So, and the idea, of course, is that we're trying to think about these examples or these questions in rational ways, right? We're trying to figure out what, if we're going to be rational, reasonable people, what we should say about these. And we might think, well, what's so important that we are being rational? Well, think about the people who we're treating, right? Like one person gets to keep his kidneys because self-ownership. Then the next person doesn't get to keep his kidneys because drowning children, right? Well, one person is going to have some questions to ask. They say, like, why are you treating us so differently? Right? And they have a right to ask that question. Right? And if you don't have a good answer, then you should probably back off. So it's not just some sort of hang-up with intellectual honesty, although that matters a lot for any philosopher worth their salt. It's also, like, these are practical issues where we're going to treat people, and we better be justified in doing so. I've been ignoring you.
So like, yeah, so I've often wondered like the same thing, and I feel like this is kind of like reminiscent of what we were talking about a little while ago when we were talking about, like, I think it was like a Supreme Court justice that said that like democracy is like the worst political system in the world except for all the other ones. And I feel like
Churchill.
You can kind of make like a similar thing here where you could say, like, if you were just going to be like, yeah, this is a really good theory, but it's wrong in a bunch of ways, but it's still pretty good.
Right.
I feel like if we're trying to be like rational, like as like a philosopher, then you should kind of start by saying, first off, no theory is going to be like flawless or not have any loopholes, because you end up getting on these trains of having to make all these concessions to like support what you originally said. But you can still recognize, but there's always going to be exceptions to every rule, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's right. Rawls actually has a nice discussion of this. Calls it. Rawls really had a knack for phrases or coining, for, like, labels. So he has a thing called reflective equilibrium. He says so that's what we're doing here. He says. So think about it. So think about, like, here, like your set of principles that you might like to embrace as a philosopher, right? So like you have full rights over yourself, but maybe you also think equality matters, freedom matters, and so on, right? Go on. And then we have a whole bunch of implications, right? So like, so let's put these like as I's down here. And then there's different ways we can, like, some of these principles have different implications, right? That's what we're trying to talk about here, like what principles would have what implications. And then it turns out maybe that you can't have both self-ownership and equality at the same time because the implications are contradictory. Right? So what Rawls is saying, well, you can, like, let's say that we draw like balloons. Like, if you take these two principles, then you're going to have these three implications. So that's one possible way of dealing with it, that you reject these two, but you accept these two, and you have these implications. But then these, they were ones that you liked before, but maybe this is the drowning child, right? Like, so we want to have self-ownership and freedom, and I get no rape, and I get, I get to do what I want, and I get other people can't. People can get to use me. I love that stuff. But then here is this drowning child, so I have to let that go. Right? Now, of course, I might just go carve it up a different way. Say, like, I'm going to have these two principles. Then I get these, right? And so he says, what you should do is you go back and forth. You start with a couple of principles that you like. You see what implications they have. And then if the set of implications is unacceptable for you, then you say, well, I have to have this one, has to be part of it. And so now you go back to the principles and you see, okay, what principles do I have to give up? And then, so you go back and forth, up until the point where the total package is about as good as you're going to get it, knowing that not all of these and not all of these are going to be in any package. Right? And so that's the equilibrium, he thinks. Once you've stopped going back and forth, you're in balance. And that's the hope. You know. So yeah, so that seems to be what we're doing here, right? We're going from principles of self-ownership or principles of equality to implications about what can be done to people. And we're moving back and forth, right? We say, well, if self-ownership is true, then you can't use anyone ever for anyone else, right? And we say, well, but hey, wait a minute. Here's this thing where, like what if you can lightly touch one person to save 10,000 lives? Well, that is puncturing the bubble, right? That is violating the... But it's crazy to say that that's not acceptable, right? Well, okay, well, that means we have to go back to our principle and change it a little, right? So the self-ownership is not absolute. So if it's not absolute, what? So, yeah, so that seems to be the method that we're using here. And there is no point where everyone's going to be happy, right? Where you get all the good principles and all the implications. And that's actually, that shouldn't come as a surprise, right? The whole reason we start doing philosophy is because we have a number of beliefs and commitments that don't fit together easily. That's why we start asking these questions, right? It's not obvious how all things fit together. We see what different sides of the question. Well, if there are different sides, then to make the whole consistent, we're going to have to choose to let some things go. Look at us getting all methodological. Super. Anyway, stop making jokes. All right, so Cohen goes against this, right? So Cohen says, actually, self-ownership, that's one of the principles we're going to let go. And he's going to try and drive a wedge somewhere in his argument. It's basically an extension of the argument from the previous page, like the 2 slides ago, right? So if a person P makes Q, another person Q help him against Q's will, then P is asserting partial ownership of Q, right, by complaining control. This is the idea. Self-ownership means you get to control you. And now here this person P, this jerk comes along, right, and he says, I get to have a claim on your body, which is an ownership claim over me. That seems to be the idea behind self-ownership, at least as Cohen understands it. Now if you assert this type of ownership, then you violate the self-ownership. So P violates Q's self-ownership. That's wrong, so P should back off. Right? It's basically the argument. Right. So far so good? So here's how Cohen goes against it. This is the main argument of the reading that we've looked at for today. Cohen wants to add something. He says, look, there's basically a negative and a positive side to ownership. The negative side is the exclusion right, where you get to tell people, you don't get to use me for your purposes. The other part, is the positive part, is if I own myself, it's not just that you don't get to use me without my consent, but I do get to use me. Right? If I'm an owner, I do have control over myself. And so if I own you, right, contrary to Nozick, but if I end up being a partial owner of you, then it must be true that I can partially control your actions. Right? I can require you to do something. Right? The slave owner owns the slave, not just in the sense that the slave owner gets to tell other slave owners you don't get to take the slave, but also they get to put the slave to work. Right? They get to tell the slave, work on the field today. And if Nozick is right, that taxation is like forced labor, like a mild form of slavery, right? He's going to have to say that other people are now put in control of the other people, and that's where the violation of self-ownership comes in. All right. But here comes the objection, right? Let's say that Q owes P a non-waivable obligation, or maybe Q just has a non-waivable obligation that's not owned to P. Then P lacks the power to control Q's actions. And here's the example that Cohen gives. Let's say that you have an obligation to your mother to take care of her if she falls ill. And it might be that your mom says, no, I don't want you to take care of me. Cohen says you have the obligation to take care of her. Oh, don't bother. No, you still got to go. Right? She's trying to waive it. It's not working. Or you might think if there's an inalienable right that people have. Terry likes these. Terry thinks there are such things. Lots of people think there are such things. Locke thought there were such things. An inalienable right is a right that cannot be waived. If you have an inalienable right to life, then I cannot tell you it's okay to kill me. I cannot release you from the obligation not to kill me because I have an inalienable right to life. Well, that means, right, if Q owes P if P has an inalienable right, then P cannot waive the obligation that Q has, and so Q has a non-waivable obligation. So P doesn't have any control over Q's actions. So you can see how the argument goes now, right? If the non-waivable, therefore non-waivable obligations are not partial ownership claims in people, even if they are not voluntarily incurred. So the idea is, Nozick says, hey, I'm a self-owner. That means there are no demands, no moral demands on me except I don't get to violate your rights. Right? And you, I cannot demand anything from you except don't violate my rights, which basically means just stay away from my bubble. Right? Why? Well, if you have any claim on me, that means you have control over me. Right? If you have a claim on me that says, I'm poor, give me your stuff, that means you're now controlling my body and my time, my life, my person. Right? And that's an ownership claim, and I'm supposed to be a self-owner. So back off. That's what Nozick said. And Cohen says, well, if you are owner of me, you better have the ability to tell me what to do, but you might not have that ability at all, because you might not be in the you might have a power to exercise control over me. I might just have that obligation. Full stop. So they're not partial ownership of people. But they can be enforced, right? We can require people to do these things. We can make them live up to their non-enforceable obligations, even if it's just in a mild way, sort of like guilting them into taking care of their mother or something like that. Or inalienable rights can be enforced. And so then it follows that the idea of self-ownership in one is false, that you cannot make people help against their will without wronging them. That's Cohen's objection. All right. Cohen has a throwaway remark, by the way, but this matters a lot. Cohen thinks that like non-owed obligations, so generally sort of free-floating obligations actually can be that over which nobody has any waivable claims or controls. They can actually justify a pretty large-scale redistribution. I thought it was an interesting claim that he's making, because he's trying to say then that we have an obligation to take care of the poor, but it's not owed to the poor. To what is it owed? Well, to nothing, right? To nobody. Cohen would say, well, it's if it is about something, that obligation, it's about equality. Right? I find that a puzzling suggestion. I'm just raising that for you to think about. But I find that a puzzling suggestion. It seems to me that if we have a reason to be concerned about equality, it's because of the people who are, the people who are not being treated unequally, or the people who are suffering because of their inequality, or something like that. It's about people who could or should be doing better that aren't. But Cohen doesn't seem to want to say that, because it's not about, we don't owe it to them, it's about equality, the pure Platonic idea, or something like that. Do you want to?
That's what I was going to ask. I was going to ask if it was less so about the individual, more so about the idea of equality.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean,
according to this particular.
That's. I mean, let's be. Cohen isn't saying that, right? I'm imputing that to him, and so maybe I'm being unfair. Although in his other work, he does think that moral principles ultimately are just really abstract, pure. He calls them fact insensitive, which means like no facts about the world have any influence on what moral principles there are. So, that's also an argument against Rawls. But basically, you have just the purest idea of equality. That's where you start. And how do we know that that's a real moral value? Well, we have this intuition. So that does sound awfully close to sort of the Platonic idea of equality. That's we access through our whatever intuitive faculty we might have. But we observe that in some way. But anyway, that seems to be an implication of at least a throwaway remark. I'm not sure if it's necessary. You might think we owe it to the poor, but the poor just don't get to exercise any control over how we fulfill that obligation or something. Why would that be the case? Why, that's a strange view to have. But anyway, he's trying to shoot a hole into the idea of self-ownership. And if this works, it seems that we have to back off further, right? So we have to back off with children strapped to tanks, right? We have to back off with fat people falling down wells. It seems that we might have to back off a little further about non-waivable or inalienable rights. And so on. Of course, Cohen says, look, Nozick, you want to say this whole theory of yours hinges upon self-ownership being this absolute right. So if we start backing off 1, 2, 3 different ways, we're already leaving the libertarian position quite far behind. And so that's all he needs at that point. All right. So we've talked a little bit about this already, but now Cohen basically what he wants to do, he wants to reject self-ownership, but he wants to reject the theory only in part. Right? So he wants to split up. He wants to, maybe this is what you had in mind. Cohen's trying to do what you said, Michaela. So like there's parts here that are really attractive, right? The parts that we say like you're not just a resource for other people's desires or needs or wants or goals or whatever, right? Like we can't just use people for our own purposes. So, and this is the thing we talked about last time, right? Like Cohen has this idea, this thought experiment. He says, why is that really plausible? Well, imagine that we had this lottery where people were appointed as donors for eyes. Some people are born with 0 functioning eyes. Lots of people are born with 2 functioning eyes. So we have this lottery where we just say, just like jury selection, right? Jury duty selection. Your social comes up in the lottery. You have to donate one of your eyes. And the self-ownership theorists are going to say, holy crap, you're crazy, right? And Cohen thinks, actually, I feel the intuition. That does sound like a horrible idea, right? So what he wants to do is he wants to reject self-ownership without being committed to eye lotteries, right? And so that's the trick he's going to have to do. So you see what he's doing, this type of move here, right? He's trying to say, can I come up with a theory where I hold on to the nice part of self-ownership without this crummy part, and like the no assistance part, in a way that's consistent. Right? So his own proposal is supposed to do that. So the suggestion he has is promoting autonomy. He says ultimately what matters is not ownership of yourself. Makes no sense, he thinks anyway. But it's autonomy. People are autonomous. That's what Kant wanted anyway. Like now I see that Cohen is trying to pull sort of all the ammunition that Nozick was giving and taking it from Nozick and putting it on behalf of his own view. Right? So Nozick, he says Kant. No, that's not what Kant meant. Kant really was about autonomy. And so what we should do is we shouldn't talk about self-ownership. We should talk about autonomy. And he thinks that if we talk about autonomy, then ultimately what we have is we do get that people are mere resources because their autonomy will be messed up. But we also have to help other people because if we don't, then their autonomy will be messed up. So you have to sort of promote autonomy overall, something like that. There's some huffing and puffing coming out of that corner.
It's because when the earlier discussion, when we were talking about one of the reading questions, for a second, I thought I got the reading question wrong. So that's why when autonomy came
Ah, okay.
it's sort of like,
You got it right?
We'll see.
Yes, we will. Yes. All right. By the way, Cohen thinks this works out quite nicely for his view, right? Because the libertarian theory or program actually does not promote autonomy at all if you think it all the way through. In the capitalist economy, the proletariat doesn't really enjoy any autonomy at all. Why? Because it requires many options, all sorts of choice, like freedom of choice to really exercise your autonomy without being forced by other people, but also being forced by circumstance and so on, right? This, of course, if you think about the Marxist picture of the economy, is a few very, very rich capitalist employers, lots and lots of really, really poor workers. Those capitalist employers, they have all the autonomy in the world, right? They have their big mansions, they have all their options, their savings, their silver cutlery and so on, like whatever. They can go on holidays, they can open a new plant, they can close it for the week, they can do whatever they want, right? But then there's the workers who need their day job day by day to just pay the bills, and so they don't get to choose, right? They have to show up for work, they have to show up for whoever will hire them at the paltry wage that they will get, that the capitalist decides they're worthy of paying, and every day they have to sort of go through that grind. And so how much autonomy is there, says Cohen? Not that much. And so, hey, libertarian, you want to talk about Kant, right? Well, Kant is about autonomy, and these proletariats are getting screwed. Not a lot of options. But that requires these many options. It requires exactly the things that we lefties are always defending, which is public free education, welfare, healthcare, whatever, right? This list keeps growing. All right. Cohen has a weird claim too, by the way, which these pages on Kant, he tries to go through Nozick's theory. Won't spend too much time on this. But if you have done your intro to ethics and you've read Kant, Cohen claims that, that ultimately not treating other people as means doesn't require just asking them for their consent. Right? That is a reading of Kant that makes some sense, and it's definitely the reading of Kant that Nozick is proposing. Right? Nozick says if you want to make sure that you don't use me as merely a means for your ends, then you have to make sure that what you do to me is something that I can agree to. And here's a way, right? Ask me. Maybe if you want to treat me as someone who has their own ends, their own goals, then you should always ask me before you use me. Right? And then if I agree, then it's fine. But if I don't agree, then you are just merely using me as a tool. And Cohen thinks that's not right. Do you know?
I don't know, I just remember that Cohen actually brings up the example. That's kind of the thing that came to mind is like whenever you're in a checkout line, instead of just handing somebody a card and checking out, you're just kind of like, oh, hi, how are you?
Right.
Talk to them.
Yeah, my favorite example is always like you are using me as a means now. Right? It's a means to get through school. Right. Here's the kicker. I am using you as a means. It's a means to get a paycheck. Right? So, is this horrible? No, it's not horrible, right? Because, at least on the Nozick's version, it's not horrible because I agreed to be used by you as a means. Right? And you agreed to be used by me as a means because we all freely chose to show up here. Now, if I force you to come here just so I can pretend to be a professor and claim a paycheck at the end of the month, that would be different, right? Then I would be using you against your will, and that would not be Kantian. And vice versa, if you forced me, or you forced me to give you a grade that's a passing grade when you're failing, right, then you're using me as a mere means to your end of getting through school, and that's wrong. So, what?
I was just gonna say, are we not forced due to attendance policies and
The short answer is no. As long as you are free to choose to be in school or not. Of course, as a kid, you're not, right? But then the Kantian will say, well, as a kid, you're not yet autonomous, and so these rules don't apply. They only apply to you if you're autonomous. So they don't apply to mice, right? Like you can use a mouse as a mere means, for example, to feed your snake or something, right? If you have a snake, you use a mouse. So does the mouse have a complaint? No, because the mouse is not autonomous. But if you use me to feed your enormous snake, right, that would be different, because I am autonomous and I do not accept. So Cohen, by the way, says this is not the right way to think about it. The way to think about it is as in terms of this attitude. He thinks it's like a practical attitude where you don't use the person in the checkout line as a mere means, not because they accept to be there, but because if the person falls ill or falls down or something, then you would help them up, or you would try and call the ambulance or something. And that shows that you care about them, even though you're still using them as a means. There's some pretty deep Kantiana going on there that we're not going to get into, but just, I think it's slightly odd that it, I mean, what exactly is the attitude that I have towards you when I'm taking your kidney, right? Is that like, yeah, like, well, I guess if you go into shock or something, then I try and save you. Then I'm not using you as a means. I mean, like, that doesn't sound right to me. Like, it seems to me that I'm. Anyway, maybe. Yeah. So, but I mean, it does seem that you're using other people just as and objectionably as a resource, nonetheless, right?
I assume that remark, though. I mean, Kant doesn't say it's wrong to use people as means. It says wrong to use
merely, isn't it? Yeah.
merely as a means. I assume I use my barber as a means.
Right.
And then, do I use him merely as a means? Well, if I thought of him as the scum of the earth, then maybe. But if I treat him as a person, express interest in what he.
Yeah, that seems to be what Cohen is saying. I think that's not really. I don't really buy that. So none of you, of course, but many students, I think, use at least some of their professors merely as means in that regard, right? Just as a class to pass. I don't want to really be here. I'll show up as much as I have to just sort of be my way through or whatever, right? And then keep it going. I sure did that as I was a student. Now, is that an immoral way of treating it? No, right? They freely choose to be there. And so, heck, I know professors who treat their students in that way.
Don't take them.
Sorry?
Don't take them.
Don't take, well, we already have them, I guess. But, you know, is that a violation of Kantian ethics? I don't really see that. I mean, it's regrettable when we see people that way, for sure.
Well,
But I don't think they're violating their
those are not
status or something.
enforceable.
Right.
Not to distinguish between what's enforceable and what's not. Those would not be enforceable.
Okay, good. So,
It's more than I.
so that student is wronging the professor.
I don't know about that case. I'm not sure.
I mean, when you use your barber, let's say the barber gets you a cheap and excellent haircut, but you do think he's a jerk. Right? And to the point where if he cuts himself, I mean, you might hand him his towel, but if the blood is gonna spray on your shirt, you're gonna be like, whatever, right? Now it doesn't happen. Right? Are you wronging the barber?
I'm not sure Kant is committed to saying that you wrong the individual in those cases.
Well, you're treating him as merely as a means. That's the bedrock, right?
Well, it depends
So yeah,
on
you
the
have to.
outcome. If there's
No. We're ethically, right? Like the non-enforceable part.
Right.
That cannot depend on the outcome. That depends on your will.
You're
It has to.
assuming, though, there has to be a victim of every will.
Well, it seems to me that if you just, no, I'm getting too far in the woods, but anyway. It seems to me that if you put it into just this attitudinal thing,
Right.
then no, that doesn't have to, like, then it's just the spirit by which you do things can be enough to wrong people.
Right.
And I think that's probably true. I mean, in principle, that should be allowed on Kant, because he's all about the maxim on which you act. So
Right.
the outcome can be fine, but if the maxim was wrong, the act was wrong nonetheless, right?
Well, the agent has fallen short, yeah.
Yeah. So the students are falling short?
I'm not sure what Kant would say about that.
Kant was very duty oriented. So
Right.
perhaps more so than how you personally feel about doing things. Maybe the fact that you're acting out of the duty to do it will be more important to him.
Yeah, well, I guess the question is, what's the content of the duty, right? So you're right about that. The question is whether the content of the duty is to have this attitude of, I heart you, or is the attitude like, I respect you as a claim presser against me, right? Like someone who, if I'm going to use them, I better use them in ways that is consistent with their will. And it's, I mean, there's a difference between these two things. You can have this attitude of fellow feeling or respect towards others, and at the same time not respect them as someone who you have to ask for permission, right? Who you have to, with whose will you have to comport, because ultimately that matters for Cohen. Cohen thinks you can fully respect someone in the Kantian sense and use them against their will. How? Well, to get equality, right? Like, I'll taking your money. Well, you say, no. Well, fat chance. I'm going to take it anyway. So, yeah, that's what anyway. It's not obvious. I'm feeling resistance, but like you can hear from Terry, it's not clear that I'm right to feel resistance. It might be. So I'm happy that Terry is here. He can call me out on my biased stuff. All right, so that autonomy, Cohen says, right? Like that's much better. No self-ownership. So what about the I lottery then, right? And then Cohen says, no, look, autonomy can give you the right answer to the I lottery. And the right answer, he says, is no I lotteries, right? So that's the thing that Faber, the professor at Oxford now, denies. She says, no, I lotteries in principle fine. But Cohen says, no, I don't want any I lotteries. But he says you don't need to be a self-ownership theorist to be against I lotteries. Right? So he wants to say, look, I don't want to be a self-ownership theorist. I want to use people sometimes, right, to get equality, at least for what Nozick would consider using. And then Nozick and Mack, right, next time will say, well, if you use people in one way to get equality, then why don't we use them in other ways to get equality, like I redistribution? Oh, you don't want that? Now they're self-owners, right? So they're saying like that's the move, right? And Cohen says, no, 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 you don't, that's not self-ownership. That's autonomy. And basically his argument is this sort of, like, messing with people's eyes interferes with their autonomy too much. Of course, it just kicks the can down the road. Like, why does that interfere with autonomy too much and like, using their labor to tap? But anyway. Here's the point he's trying to make why you should see that autonomy and not self-ownership is ultimately what matters. Why it's not a claim about self-ownership. And so he has this artificial eye lottery. And he says, suppose that people had artificial eyes implanted at birth. We're born without eyes, but we found sort of like enough technology that we can have these artificial eyes, that we have these sockets that can plug to artificial eyes, right? And so now you can see. But then some people, they need to be implanted at birth, or it's doesn't work. And so we need to read it. Well, I forget what the exact story is. So then some people are born without it, or they go defunct or something. Anyway, you have to, some story he tells why we should, the only way to get other people their artificial eyes is by taking them from others. And he says, would that be allowed? He says, well, if the answer is no, if you would be against the artificial eye lottery, so the redistribution of the artificial eyes, then it cannot be that you're against it for self-ownership reasons, because here's why. The artificial eyes, being artificial, they're not part of your natural self. You weren't born with them. But if something's not part of your natural self, cannot be protected by self-ownership, and therefore self-ownership cannot protect the artificial eyes. And so here, but still, obviously, the wrongness of an action that cannot be explained by referring to rights that one doesn't have. Right? So you cannot explain the wrongness of the artificial eye snatching by talking about self-ownership, and then we need some other story, right? And so the wrongness of the artificial eye snatching is in the interference with autonomy again. And he says, well, if that's true about artificial eyes, it's also true about natural eyes. So we don't need to talk about self-ownership at any point. And now he thinks he has you right where he wants you, right? He can get you the good stuff about self-ownership, which is no eye lotteries, no kidney lotteries, no sex chambers or whatever, right? Like that all stuff is none of that. But you get all the good stuff, at least if you're of the left-wing persuasions that Cohen is, all the good stuff, which is redistribution for equality, social services, what have you. Because those things are needed to promote the autonomy of other people, and eye lotteries too much interfere with the autonomy of those people, and so now we have a type of acceptable balance, he thinks, between not using people just as resources and having them be subject to assistance duties or obligations. That's more or less the argument. All right. Any questions about this? Well, we have 1 minute left. I have a bunch of questions. Here are some. You can read them on Canvas, because we don't have time to get through this. If you want to talk some more, stick around. But I'm going to actually finish 1 minute early for a change. One time this term. Right? All right. Hope to see you guys on Thursday. If not, hope to see you around.